Bury Me in a Free Land by Francis E. W. Harper. Make me a grave wherever you will, in a lowly plain or a lofty hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but not in a land where men are slaves. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. His shadow above my silent tomb would make it a place of fearful gloom. I could not rest if I heard the tread of a coffle gang to the shambles led, of the mother's shriek of wild despair, rise like a curse on the trembling air. I could not sleep if I saw the lash, drinking her blood at each fearful gash. And I saw her babes torn from her breast, like trembling doves from their parents' nest. I'd shudder and start if I heard the bay of bloodhounds seizing their human prey. And I heard the captive plead in vain as they bound afresh his galling chain. If I saw young girls from their mother's arms, battered and sold for their youthful charms, my eye would flash with a mournful flame, my death-pale cheek grow red with shame. I would sleep, dear friends, where bloated might can rob no man of his dearest right. My rest shall be calm in any grave, where none can call his brother a slave. I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of the passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me not in a land of slaves.
Okay, thank you so much, Monica Cruz, for reciting that beautiful poem. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Nance. I'm speaking to you from Denver, and I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I want to welcome you to the second installment of the Black Struggle as Class Struggle series, a deeper look into the revolutionary elements of Reconstruction, the Civil War, and more. This series is a 4-part series that's intended to uplift Black revolutionary history in this country, its central role in the development of society today, and to underscore the idea that revolution is possible within the United States. Just a couple of notes before we begin. Just make sure that your Zoom name is kind of reflective of the name that you signed up with when you register for the classes. It's going to help us with sort of putting you into the proper discussion group. This session is going to focus on Reconstruction, the period that began on the heels of the Civil War, and although had a decisive end, has been coined as America's unfinished revolution. Reconstruction contains a very rich and nuanced history, and we're not going to be able to cover everything in such a short time tonight. But it's not about dates and times, but rather the lessons that we want to take from this, right? We want to discuss some very important themes tonight: knowing your enemy, knowing yourself, understanding the role of different social forces of the working class and of the ruling class, power of the leadership of the most impacted, right? When you lift up from the bottom, everyone rises. Revolution happens in stages. For every action, there is a reaction. We want to show how the pursuit of answers to the most important questions of the time, what to do with the 4 million newly freed Black people, how to admit or readmit former Confederate states into the Union, how those questions drew out competing interests within the various sectors of the ruling class, of the newly freed Black people and poor white people. We want to discuss how during this period, formerly enslaved Black people in the South achieved some of the most far-reaching gains that our people have ever seen, gains that after being stripped away wouldn't be seen again until the civil rights struggle that would occur nearly a century later. And just how Reconstruction was defeated and how the precedents of that defeat were sort of set in stone after its ultimate demise. Throughout this presentation, we're going to be quoting Du Bois, who studied Reconstruction in the 1930s and released Black Reconstruction in America in 1935, because he was trying to solve the problems of his day. So we study Reconstruction now to solve the problems of our day. So there are 3 phases of this unfinished revolution. The first is wartime Reconstruction, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. And this phase is marked by the confiscation of Southern land and measures designed principally to weaken the Confederacy. These measures that were enacted during this period, like Sherman's Order 15, really laid the foundation for subsequent phases regarding land ownership, as well as debunking common misconceptions about Black people. This phase that follows is titled Presidential Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1867. And this phase is when the betrayal of Reconstruction really begins. It contains both notable gains, like the formation of the Freedmen's Bureau, as well as dire setbacks, like the Black Codes. The events that occurred during this phase are a springboard for the sharpening political struggles that follow. The next phase being Radical Reconstruction, which takes place during 1867 to 1877. Also known as Congressional Reconstruction, this phase is in many ways a representation of the apex of Reconstruction. It delivers landmark legislation and the thrust of Black political power. It also facilitates the reconciliation of sharp divisions within the ruling class with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876. Next slide, please. So property rights and ownership saw many different hands during Reconstruction, and it was one of the few times in history where large swaths of privatized land was seized by the federal government and redistributed, enfranchising oppressed communities economically on a mass scale. Land was the source of prosperity and power, and it still remains so today, but then it was an essential component of the dominant productive forces along with slave labor, and it had been the source of most of the wealth of the United States due to its agricultural capacity. Freed Black people, knowing that real freedom lay only in their ownership of the land, launched a powerful movement for redistribution of the land formerly owned by the planter class. Next slide. So in 1861, the Union captured Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, as well as their main harbor, Port Royal, simultaneously freeing about 10,000 enslaved Black people. You can see that little red pin drops on the port there and the islands along the coast. This is where the experiment took place. Let's go to the next slide. So pictured here are newly liberated Black people in South Carolina in 1862. And we're gonna go to the next slide now to talk more about the experiment. This region will become the basis of milestone redistribution of land, such as the Port Royal experiment, right? And it's one of the first major attempts by Northerners to reconstruct the Southern political and economic system, right? This experiment really shifted the notion of Black people's capability and self-reliance. It demonstrated that they were not only capable, but they could thrive outside of the institution of slavery when given the tools to succeed. It also set the stage for what was possible under Reconstruction. It's often referred to as a rehearsal for Reconstruction, this experiment. And another aspect of this was education and training of freedmen, which helped initiate a call for the systematic education of free Black people all over the country. And the response was to send missionaries and educators that would then travel to South Carolina, one of which I want to highlight is Charlotte FORTEN. Can we go to the next slide? So Charlotte FORTEN was the first Northern Black teacher to arrive in the South. And in addition to being an educator, was a poet and a very influential anti-slavery activist. In a letter to William Lloyd Garrison from the school in South Carolina, she writes, "At present, our school is small, many of the children being ill with whooping cough, but in general, it averages 80 or 90. It is a great happiness to teach them. I wish some of these persons at the North who say that race is hopelessly and naturally inferior could see the readiness with which these children, so long oppressed and deprived of every privilege, learn and understand. Calls for education would see more comprehensive responses in later periods of Reconstruction that we're going to get into a bit later." Next slide. So a year after that letter, in 1863, new land redistribution policies allowed 40,000 acres of former Confederate plantations to be divided among 16,000 Black families. 2,000 acres of that land was purchased by local Black families almost immediately. Other parts of the land were purchased by white Northerners like Edward Philbrick, who bought 7,000 acres of land, which previously constituted 11 plantations. And this land was able to support 950, nearly 1,000 Black tenant farmers. Black Islanders would soon found the town of Mitchellville, which was named after a Union general, and Mitchellville would be the first of many all Black communities. And now I want to play a clip on this next slide that describes a little bit more about this experiment.
stop sharing 1 second to make sure I'm sharing my audio.
In 1862, Secretary of Treasury Salmon P. Chase, with the help of Everett Pierce, spearheaded the free labor operation which became known as the Port Royal Experiment. Although Chase and Pierce believed African Americans were unprepared, given their former enslavement, the goal of the Port Royal Experiment was to prepare them as citizens once the war was over. If the Sea Islands proved to be a success, Edward Pierce believed that the Port Royal Experiment would serve as a national model for emancipation. With the capture of the South Carolina Sea Islands months before, the Union could employ the black population to harvest the uncultivated cotton and make enough money to sustain their war efforts. The black men and women would be paid for their labor, educated, and given a chance to acquire land of their own for agricultural production. According to historian Willie Lee Rose, who has written extensively on the Port Royal Experiment, each plantation would be fully equipped with agricultural tools, livestock, and other supplies. Furthermore, each plantation was to be supervised by a superintendent, usually a young missionary, male or female, and recent college graduate, whose job was to ensure African Americans harvested the crop without the threat of physical punishment. In addition to harvesting cotton, black men and women would plant corn and potato crops in which they used to feed themselves and their families. Ultimately, if free labor under the Port Royal Experiment proved to be more profitable than slave labor, the formerly enslaved population would not have to be supported by either the government or charities, thus silencing the opponents of emancipation and advancing the cause of black freedom. Although the Port Royal Experiment seemed great in theory, black men and women were not always as enthusiastic about the plan as the missionaries. Cotton production reminded them of the tyranny of slavery, in which black men and women were forced to work without pay, brutal hours under the lash of the slave whip. Furthermore, many of the former slaves' basic needs were unmet. Despite the change of status, the black communities in the Sea Islands had little to eat and were still scantily clothed. Death and sickness pervaded due to a lack of adequate medical care, and they were not always paid in a timely manner. This led them to initially rebel against the labor experiment. Historian Ira Berlin uncovered one disagreement between the black population and plantation superintendents when a group of African Americans stated, "We will work. You shan't call us lazy. We will never work again for Old Mass and his whip. We only wanted to know if we were sure of our pay. It is so hard living without clothes a whole year, and we get sick putting seawater in our hominy and haven't had our salt for so many months." Black men and women made it clear that they were more than willing to work. However, they would never endure the abuses of slavery ever again. They negotiated the terms of their labor by withholding their services if the Union did not deliver on their promises. Thus, for the Port Royal Experiment to reach success, it would have to ensure that the needs of the workers were fully met, one being access to education.
Thank you. If we can go to the next slide. So, among the land that was confiscated by the Union was this property along South Carolina islands there was property in South Carolina and there were islands off the coast of Georgia. And it constituted about 400,000 acres and it was utilized in what was called Sherman Special Field Order Number 15, which would reserve it exclusively for the use of nearly 40,000 formerly enslaved Black people to redistribute into 40-acre plots. And in a later order, Sherman authorized the Army to loan mules to the newly settled farmers. And this is sort of where the term 40 acres and a mule comes from. And it was in this order in particular, it was an example of an intersection of like one avenue of the interests of the Northern officials who needed to politically disarm elements of the former slaveocracy in the Union, and another avenue which was the heightened sort of struggle of freed Black people who were seeking to empower themselves and realize a dignified way of living, and also have a say in determining their circumstances. And I say this is an intersection because General Sherman in particular wasn't necessarily an anti-racist. He didn't really care so much about racial equality. He cared more about punishing the Confederate planters along the rice coast of the South for their role in starting the Civil War. And he felt that he would be accomplishing sort of killing two birds with one stone by punishing these planters and while addressing the question of what to do with this newly free class of Black laborers in the South. Next slide. And we can skip this one too. So the question of how far the federal government will go to ensure Black freedom raised a significant contradiction within the ruling class, and it began to chip away at its unity. We see a lot of power struggles during this period play out as different visions for Reconstruction make headway and others lose support, and political hegemony really continues to fluctuate. It's really a battle for how to reconstruct the South and under whose leadership. Next slide. So as the Civil War came to a close, the government began to focus on how to readmit Southern states back into the Union, and this will become a point of contention. Abraham Lincoln, he had this 10% plan where he said if there were 10% of loyal Southerners in the electorate, then they could form a new government. People thought this was not sufficient. They said there's no way this could promise a stable government, and there's no role for Black people outlined here. So the radical Republicans, they sort of countered this with what's known as the Wade-Davis bill. They said, if there's 50% of people in the South who swear an allegiance to the United States, then they can rejoin. There was also stipulations that provided safeguards for Black civil rights there. But Lincoln ends up killing this bill with a pocket veto, and the 10% plan becomes law. And I think this in some ways represents a sort of a broader struggle within the government that would play out into other phases as well. Next slide. So at the time, radical Republicans were quickly becoming a political driving force of Reconstruction. Their political base was in Congress, where they held a majority. And as the majority, they could determine whether someone was unfit to serve. And they would actually later take roll during Congress and deliberately leave out names of former Confederates who had acquired a seat in Congress, and leaving them unable to actually participate in Congress because of the rules at the time. And this was a huge act of defiance in sort of the upper stratas of the institutional powers of the country. This power struggle would continue, and questions of how to maintain seats in government would sometimes be answered by sacrificing the sort of advocacy for Black rights of people rather than continuing to lose elections. Next slide. So after Lincoln's assassination in 1865, Andrew Johnson becomes the first US president to ascend office by this sort of technicality, and he would serve as the door that let the Old South back in. Eric Foner, he describes him as a man of great ambition, but little achievements before he became president. Johnson was pro-slavery for most of his political career. And in the beginning, really during the war, he postured himself as a friend of the radicals who would be tough on Confederate rebels, but this would quickly subside and he would show his true colors. He began almost immediately sort of replacing the more progressive state officials that Lincoln's administration had put into place with Southern aristocrats. His role would be sort of ultimately dismantling these governments and filling the seats with a coalition of aristocrats who had led the South before the war, people who he said possessed social importance, irreproachable morals, proper education, suitable age. Like this was the planter class. When officials warned that these actions would revive slavery by another name, those officials were fired and replaced with people who were happy to facilitate the return of the slaveocracy's leadership. And lastly, actually, this isn't lastly, but another point is that he fast-tracked pardons for the Confederate. There was a rule that you had to get a presidential pardon if you aided the Confederacy during the Civil War, if you wanted to evade any retribution. And Johnson just begins indiscriminately pardoning almost anyone who asked, sometimes 100 in a day. And, you know, I think that this plays into his upbringing. He was from the South and he was poor. And I think that there were these sort of desires to have a life of privilege. So rubbing elbows with these sort of Southern elite must have been gratifying. But, you know, he was also a racist, right? So I think that he shared some of these beliefs with these rebels. He's publicly refused to shake Frederick Douglass's hand at a safe concert event. And he was gone on record as saying that Black people were least capable of leading government out of all the races. And that's kind of quite ironic because he would later become the subject of the country's first presidential impeachment trial, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And lastly, I'll just say that he reversed the very same year that it came out, Sherman's Order 15, at the end of the war. He basically gave the land back, right? And it included most of the land that Freedmen's had already settled on. And essentially he begins to dispossess tens of thousands of Black people were now landowners, right? Many of whom had fought in the Civil War and had been loyal to the Union. In Georgia and South Carolina, some of the Black farmers resisted this reversal, driving away farmer owners with guns. In other places, federal troops evicted them by force, leaving them with no other choice than to become a sharecropper, often for the very same slave masters that they were once in bondage under. A lot of this betrayal was sort of facilitated intentionally during a period where Congress was out of session. Okay, and with that, I'll pass it over to Sasha. We can go to the next slide.
All right, so hi everyone. So we're just kind of gonna jump right into it and just talk a little bit about the Freedmen's Bureau. I thought I'd start off with a video that gives you a sense of kind of like what the Freedmen's Bureau was and what it was about. And then we can just kind of talk about the gains of Reconstruction. So let's go to the next slide into the video.
On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order that proclaimed the freedom of enslaved African Americans in states that had seceded from the Union. Over 2 years later, the Civil War was ended, and by December of 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery in the United States. Each of these steps helped nearly 4 million former slaves gain their freedom. These African Americans faced a long, difficult road to independence, and for many, it was a challenge even to find shelter and work. One of the first steps President Lincoln took to help them was urging Congress to establish the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, more commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, in March of 1865. The Bureau helped former slaves secure jobs by drawing up labor contracts and providing temporary housing, food, and medical care. It was also tasked with reuniting families that were separated during the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau legalized marriages and kept detailed records that are housed in the National Archives to this day. But perhaps its greatest achievement was in education. The Freedmen's Bureau established thousands of freedmen's schools in the South, increasing Black literacy to above 30%. It also built several colleges that are known today as historically Black colleges and universities, like Fisk University in Tennessee and Howard University in Washington, D.C., granting more than 1,000 college degrees to African Americans by 1872.
Okay. All right, so my material is a little bit more dense, so I'm just going to kind of cover it as quickly as I can, but still try and cover a lot of major things that happen kind of during these different periods. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about like Black autonomy. So we hear a lot about the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau guided and assisting Black people in building an independent cultural and political identity free of white supervision. The Bureau, although one of the most important federal programs during Reconstruction, was not the primary means of building free society. It was the freedmen themselves that began to establish the revolutionary normalcy of freedmen identity. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how actual freedmen were able to build this system, right? So we have to think about the context of, yes, there was the Freedmen's Bureau, which is absolutely important, but there's actually this kind of wave that happens where the Johnson administration, right, is also kind of countering some of the things that are happening and the limitations of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so the Freedmen's Society has to kind of be able to institutionalize and build itself, right? And so I have this quote, "We free now," which is actually we's free now, but I ain't know how to spell we's. So we free now, what does that mean? It means basically that was something that people felt during that time. It was very real. We are literally free of bondage. And it was a taunt to white people saying, listen, you can't do a damn thing because we free. It was just saying that we're able to do things that we could never do in bondage. We can go places that we couldn't do. We could do all of these things. And that was just really the basis of really kind of being able to like have this taste for power in a sense, right? Migration. So between 1865 and 1870, the Black population of the South's 10 largest cities double. Right? So they draw protection. The reason that so many people were flocking to the South in particular is because they were drawing on the protection of the Union soldiers, some of which were Black, and the Freedmen's Bureau. So it's just like, but just the ability to be able to get up and go, migration in itself was such a like an idea of being able to like, all right, we're able to move freely. The role of the Black church. So also just kind of thinking about the pitfalls to some extent of the Freedmen's Bureau, you have these institutions that started to come to life. So you have this underground kind of cultural crux of the Black community that existed even through slavery. And then you also have these freemen, like 500,000 freemen that are living in the North also, who have this kind of political formation and these kind of cultural formations, and they're able to come together once you have this abolition of slavery. And so the Black church is really at the crux of that, right? When it comes to politics and education. And, you know, we hear a lot about what the Freedmen's Bureau has done also, but also understanding that church played the Black churches played significant roles. Pastors often kind of went on to become, political officials, or not pastors, deacons, whatever, kind of the head of the churches. And then also in educational institutions. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for freemen churches to actually be able to be the center of many things. And I'm going to kind of expand on that a little bit more. So there was also the Black state conventions. So there were these conventions that had happened in different states throughout the South. And the idea was now you have these opportunities to kind of have political discourse about different things. Mainly on the table, obviously, was land and suffrage, right? We wanted to be able to have land. And I mean, at this point in 1865, Black people genuinely felt that they were going to be awarded land. And this is obviously the special order that we had just spoke about too. But it was just this like genuine belief that like, okay, now how do we kind of politically achieve to do that? And so they started to set up these different conventions in these different states. And it kind of showed the different dynamics that existed at that time. You had kind of these like former slaves, right? The freedmen, but you also had this different aspect of freedmen society, which are these mulattoes or individuals who are already free, who see themselves as more prominent, who see themselves as kind of like able to articulate the Black cause a little bit better. And so the early phase of Reconstruction, they're kind of leading these state conventions, but we see later on, they just don't have the ability or the kind of vigor to move people. And so by 1866, they dramatically decrease. And they dramatically decrease. And we see that actually a shift to some extent where you have more freedmen that are actually leading these conventions that are a part of them. And many of them had actually, the ones that were there had come from Black churches, being political leaders in some way, and then kind of being able to transfer into that role. Black women and kind of like them resisting patriarchy. Black women in their role was also being defined during this period. Patriarchy was a huge part of just women being able to kind of identify, and that was normal for white women. And so Black freedmen often kind of felt that Black women had a particular way that they should be able to view themselves. But this was not how a lot of women wanted to necessarily identify. So the Freedmen's Bureau is really notable for kind of recording marriage licenses, which was a really big part of it. But they also recorded disputes and complaints. And so on record, there are hundreds of complaints of women complaining about beatings, infidelities, inability to pay child support, and just kind of objecting to any patriarchal standards and norms, and just saying like, we don't want to kind of follow these systems. And kind of showing the early ideals of like feminism to some extent, and saying like, well, we want to be able to establish ourselves in the home and don't want to necessarily echo kind of the way white women see themselves, right? And then there was the buying land. And so this is kind of what I was talking about too, about the Black church. So the Black church kind of, again, coming to this idea of being everywhere. So if you're in an institution, like if you're in a place, let's say, where you're not necessarily able to kind of have access to a Freedmen's Bureau, you are always kind of within close proximity to a church. And some churches are more successful than others. Churches are also fighting for autonomy. You see a lot of images where you have like white teachers teaching Black students, or you have white white preachers or white pastors kind of teaching to these all Black churches, but that's not really what freedmen wanted, right? And so you also saw this kind of division that was trying to happen for autonomy so they can have control over their own churches. And this was also a very radical thing. I mean, this was something that the white Southerners and even, you know, some Northerners couldn't really understand why they wanted this level of autonomy in their own churches. And they really went as far as to like not have to bring their own pastors at time, not only hear Black people speak, or even to go as far as to say, like, we will do everything we can, pool our money together the best we can if we have the ability to do that, and buy land so that we can build a church for ourselves. And because of these kind of things, they were able to build institutions like schools, build institutions that help kind of later lay the foundation for some political organizations too. And so just quickly, some of these organizations that aren't necessarily the most political, but some fraternal organizations, debating clubs, fire companies, but also like equal rights groups. Like many of these social groups that had happened during Reconstruction, that had like really flourished during the early parts of Reconstruction, really started ultimately within the Black church. So it really kind of shows the foundational basis of like the cultural aspect of what Black life looked like, but really what the freedmen were aspiring for essentially, right? These multifaceted dimensions of what their lives had looked like at the time. So next slide. Okay, so Congress proposed and enacted a series of laws that reflected the split between radical Republicans and Democrats on how to introduce the Southern states to the Union. Johnson makes an unprecedented veto of the Civil Rights Act, which causes division between him and Congress. So, what is radical republicanism? So during this time, you see this kind of like growth of this radical Republican foundation, right? And you have individuals who are particularly noted for that. Like the most noted individual that I'm sure people may have heard of is Thaddeus Stevens. And then there was also Charles Sumner, right? And Charles Sumner was like this abolitionist, and they identified with kind of like abolitionist theories, and we're very much kind of aligned with the idea of Black suffrage. We're very much kind of like feeling that that was the way to be able to ultimately unite the South. Well, not unite the South, but rather unite the Union, because, you know, the Southern states were still seceded, had still seceded from the Union. So the ultimate question on the table during Reconstruction was the literal question of how do we reconstruct our political system at this time? And so the radical Republicans, who were kind of like the more obviously radical sect of that, felt that this was the way to ultimately do that. We have to be able to kind of pull from the kind of abolition sense. Now, did that reflect all of the Republicans? No, but the radical Republicans did have significant gains within the Congress at that time. So I'm gonna just skip around a little bit because I have a video. So the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment was, okay, well, you know, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was specifically really kind of this idea of really what radical republicanism really was at that time, right? And so you get this sense of it's laying the foundation for all of these other acts that are going to be proposed. But what really is significant the most about it is that it is passed, and then Johnson comes and he vetoes it. This is totally unprecedented. And the Civil Rights Act is just basically saying that is exactly what it's calling for, right? We're going to give civil rights, it's calling for suffrage, it's calling for things that like at the time, people really didn't, it was really would have been something that was absolutely unseen to some extent, right? And this was really their way to weaken the South, which is really a Republican strategy. It's like, if we give rights to states that are not loyal to the Union, right? So Black suffrage, for instance, to states that are not loyal to the Union, this is a great way to weaken representation in the South and for us to maintain control of Congress. And so it was a tactic to be able to maintain control. So a series of amendments and backs and forths, and this caused rifts, because Johnson, who was totally stubborn, right, totally racist, is just like, I just want to do things my way entirely. And Congress, which is being really kind of led to some extent by these like radical Republicans. You see this kind of back and forth shift. That's not necessarily what Johnson is looking for at the time, right? He kind of wants to do away with that and wants to see the Union be able to kind of unite with the South on the South's term. So the 14th Amendment, I'm going to jump to, and the 14th Amendment was kind of a way to that pulled from the Civil Rights Act, right? And so people know it as this is the amendment that gave citizenship to everyone, and everyone became a citizen in the United States. And I mean, to some extent, yes, that's true. But the reason that it was able to be passed was because that there were clauses that were passed that were able to then kind of grant citizenship. Like if someone, for instance, was of a race, of a particular race, and that person was determined that they were ineligible to be seen as a citizen, that anyone of that race was not eligible to be seen as a citizen. I mean, the 14th Amendment kind of caused a little bit of panic because the idea was this is going to shift representation, right? Again, that tactic coming out again. If anyone's a citizen, who's going to be represented? How many kind of people can be represented in Congress? How many people cannot? This kind of thing, right? And so people were just like, well, what do we do? Who's going to be recognized as a citizen? Who's not going to be recognized as a citizen? How do we go about doing it? And it actually ended up passing. And that was actually one of the ways that it did. The Reconstruction Act. I just got wild notes right now. So the Reconstruction Act of 1867, okay. So the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is like an immense act. This act is actually like the continuation to some extent of the Civil Rights Act, right? But the difference here is that you see kind of the power being pulled amongst this like Republican base. This Republican base that's like really kind of like pissed off with Johnson. They veto the bill, and they really are kind of desperately looking for ways to be able to kind of control Congress and ultimately be able to kind of like gain control of the Union, right? And so how do we essentially do this? And so the Civil Rights Act says that like Johnson's government is subject to modification or abolition. It divided 11 Confederate states into, it divided 11 Confederate states into military districts, established military rule and suffrage in defeat of Confederate states. So again, so this tactic kind of comes right back once again. So suffrage in those defeated Confederate territories. So a veto, Johnson, of course, doesn't want this and tries to veto this, and he actually gets vetoed on this Reconstruction Act. The Reconstruction Act sets off a chain of events because it's a huge act that says a lot. This is also just saying that though there was some political gains that were made here, there was still no like structural federal programs to actually find a way to enact it, right? So you have the Freedmen's Bureau. Now you have these kind of like these military districts that are being established, and you have some military rule here. But like, in what way is this actually going to be enacted? How are we going to enforce these things? And that's not being done. So you have this very like utopian, distant kind of view of how to actually accomplish these things. And so it's distant to the actual needs of the freedmen at this time. And so though these amendments are very pivotal amendments in being able to kind of change these dynamics, it also leaves this very open reality of like, how is this actually going to be accomplished? So with that being said, I think this video kind of helps. Show some of the aspects too. So next slide.
Immediately when the Civil Rights Bill came to the floor, Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats alike railed against the bill. They believed that it was unconstitutional.
Opponents of the bill thought the U.S. government had no business telling the proprietors of restaurants or the people who run railroads who they could admit. These are private businesses, and they can decide who their clientele is.
The critics believed that it was not about non-discrimination. They saw it as about social equality. And their view is that social equality could not be legislated. It couldn't be enforced. It shouldn't be imposed.
This is pushing integration that is unnatural.
You're gonna force a white person to ride next to a black person, and the next thing you know, you're gonna force a white person to have a black person over for dinner, or interracial marriage.
So they were apoplectic about the idea that they had to protect their whiteness, and in particular, protect their white women against this exposure to African Americans.
Near the end of the first full day of debate, most members were given 20 minutes each to speak. And Alexander Stephens of Georgia, former Confederate vice president, stood up feebly because he was confined to a wheelchair and requested a full hour to speak. And
Okay, so next slide. So I'm gonna have to go a little quick because I tend to drone on. So, no, not skipping that though. All right, so the Reconstruction Act. So the Reconstruction Act reinvigorates militant demands for political change within the Black community, and Black institutions became highly politicized. This atmosphere made it possible for freedmen to expand Black political leadership in the Reconstruction era. So I'm just gonna quickly kind of meld these together. When we're talking about this in this area, like, so now the Reconstruction Act is passed, right? So 1865, everyone's fired up. They're going to get land. Everyone's, you know, they're free. And now in 1867, you have this, like, this act that says, like, all right, we're going to, like, you know, this idea, like, we're right back in this place before where we're going to be able to get these things, but we're not asking for it, right? And so we kind of had this idea that, like, Black people were just kind of hoping and waiting, when in fact they were militantly demanding that these changes took place. So I'm just going to give a few examples and then I'm just going to move on, right? For instance, strikes of longshoremen in Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, Richmond, and New Orleans, right? So they were all pursuing equality and seizing opportunities for change. They were also holding strike. So also there were some leagues that were holding strikes in, sorry. There were also some leagues that were holding strikes in different areas of the South as well. And so some of these places, like, you had Black labor that were just saying, like, look, we're tired of these labor contracts. We're tired of having to do this. We're ready to kind of be able to be paid either fair wages. And then some people straight up were saying, look, we feel like we're owed the land that we've been denied for the time that we have. And so we know that our labor is important to you, and we're willing to use this as a political bargaining chip, right? Calling for strikes. And then there was also the Union League. So the Union League was this kind of like political voice for freedmen. I mean, during this time, you can imagine something like this had just kind of exploded in membership. People were rapidly joining, and there even was kind of this kind of race mixture, this mixed race base that had even occurred there as well. So you had this like base, this mobilization that's occurring during this time, which is huge. You have all of these different sectors of society. You have Black labor, you have people demanding reparations, you have all of these reinvigorations, like of the Black political life that we were talking about, right? Like all these institutions, these social clubs, all these things are now being highly politicized, right? And people are mobilizing for the Republican Party as well, right? They're mobilizing on the basis that we want to see change. And this is something that's totally real and new. And people are seeing that they have the opportunity, and they're seizing that opportunity, and they're taking it, and they're using everything that they can at their disposal. So I'm gonna go to the next slide then. Okay, so I'm going to ask one person this question. So can someone tell me why they think this political mobilization was significant? So that some dynamics to consider. The effects of mass political work, the shifting relationship of Congress, and what was the difference that suffrage meant to the freedmen versus these radical Republicans, right?
Yeah, I can try to answer the question.
Okay, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this political mobilization was significant in the sense that, like, it got people to kind of rally around like one thing, like they were trying to really like go for in terms of trying to reclaim what had been taken from them, try to focus on like what could they do to try to have a spirit of self-determination, not in a like capitalist sense of like domination, but just try to have a sense of self-determination, try to determine their own future. And I think that was significant in terms of that was something where the collective really, or those that were representatives were really moving on behalf of the collective to try to empower the whole going forward. I don't know if I'm on the right path, but.
Yeah, that sounds great to me. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love that answer, actually. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So they're absolutely kind of tapping into all these things that they were promised in the beginning. They're being promised these things. And now they're saying like, well, we're no longer being promised it. We're going to do everything in our power to make these things happen. Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm way over. I knew this was going to happen. All right. So Southern Reconstruction. So Republicans gained control of the South from 1868 to 1870, but were unable to keep themselves united in implementing any Federalist policies. So Black political advancement is seen as an accessory to the Republican agenda as they deferred to Democratic attempts to strip Black gains in the South. During this time, however, immense legislative gains were made for Black representation. So we're going to kind of talk about how this is like a dual thing, right? So let's just start off with the impeachment of Johnson, right? So in 1868, Johnson is impeached, right? So we know all the factors that are kind of leading up to that. The Republicans are kind of finally able to find a basis to be able, a legal basis to be able to have him taken out of office. They decide they want to indict him. He's overwhelmingly voted to be impeached and is later actually acquitted. Now, what is then happening at this point is this transition, right? And the reason I'm putting the emphasis on the transition is just understanding kind of the role of what was happening in the governmental structure at this time. So these radical Republicans are shifting. They're shifting like dramatically, where they're no longer these radical individuals, where they're becoming more and more moderate. And we see this in where I'm going to talk about a little bit in factionalism, but they're becoming more moderate. So these kind of like older individuals who before were kind of the leaders of this radical Republican party, they're dying out, right? They're dying out, and these more moderate, conservative Republicans are coming up, and they're feeling like, you know what? We don't want that, right? We're not here to do all these things for abolition. That's not what we're specifically here, really thinking about the best way for us to align the union once again, right? And then they start to kind of develop themselves with this, with these merchant classes, right? So these really kind of like really well-to-do kind of like classes, and they're just kind of aligning themselves and saying like, look, we're making plans to build the economy and build the economy in such a way. Yes, this was the shift in the Republican Party, correct. And so we're building the economy in such a way that we kind of find ourselves wanting to be more moderate, more conservative. And we see this when they choose Ulysses S. Grant as this kind of like person to potentially be the leader of the Republican Party, right? Ulysses S. Grant, who is not really radical, who's someone who the Democrats were even looking at one point. And so they're really kind of looking at this like, all right, this is really a shift that's happening and things are changing. And so when we see this kind of in the context of that, then we see when the Republican Party has control of the South, this is also during that time where you're seeing the shift happen. So even during the radical Republican days, there really was never any plan to truly be able to implement these kind of almost utopian things that they wanted to do, right? And so now we're seeing the shift of this radical republicanism to this way more moderate and conservative tone. But now Republicans have control of the South. And so what does that mean? So it means that all of these things, right? The Civil Rights Act is passed. I mean, not the Civil Rights Act, the Reconstitution Act is passed. And now we're seeing kind of this like legitimate aspiration of Black legislation. But this caused factionalism within the Republican Party. So you have Blacks who are genuinely being, who have genuine, gubernatorial aspirations, and they are not really being taken serious. There's not really that much representation. They're not being taken that serious. And you see this kind of, this division between different types of Republicans during this time and how they wanted to implement that rule in the South. Right. And so they kind of wanted to like, listen, you could play second string if even you being here. And some of them were even coming out and being like racist. Right. So they were being taunted by Democrats who we know obviously were Southern loyalists. And mind you, this is in Confederate kind of rebel states. So this is even more like maddening, right, to these like individuals who don't want to see this and then kind of want to have some type of union that happens. It's like, how do we kind of balance all of that? But in the midst of this happening, there are huge gains that are made in terms of Black people actually being able to take legislative services. So there were over 600 Blacks that served as legislators, and the majority of them were former slaves, right? There were 16 Blacks in Congress. And it just kind of started, and it started to kind of build like a lot of like resentment and things like that. But there was also this like idea of like, so in Georgia, for instance, there were 216 Georgia lawmakers, right? But only 32 were non-white. So these kind of like numbers occurred throughout the Southern states, right? Where you had this kind of absolute disproportionate representation, even though in a lot of these states, they might have actually had mostly Black inhabitants. And this started to cause rift too, because these Black legislators, some of them felt like this is absolutely, not fair to us. And some were more kind of like, well, we want to not kind of be in those situations. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up. I'm sorry about this. So anyway, in that case, the radicals continue to kind of shift to the center and become more moderate. And this is even happening during, of course, the 15th Amendment. So Ulysses S. Grant ratifies the 15th Amendment, right? And as we famously know, this gives Black people the right to vote. And I mean, there were amazing gains. This is much later than this period here. There were around 2,000 Black men who had won local, state, and federal offices and in former Confederate states. I can't talk today. So so there were some gains that were also made during this period too, but then there's also still this dynamic shift. And the reason I keep kind of highlighting that is because as I pass it off to the next person who's going to speak, I think I want to give a sense of like a continuation of how this started to go from all of these major gains, all of these great things that were happening, to then we go to the next part of it, the actual end of Reconstruction, right? So with that, I'm going to end it and pass it off to Kim. Oh wait, next slide. Can I get the next slide? My bad, I got one more slide. Yes, Benjamin Randolph. So this is actually how I wanted to pass it off to Kim. So Benjamin Randolph is a great example of one of those individuals. He was head of the South Carolina Republican Committee. He actually had quite a few roles within the Republican Party at that time, and was actually later assassinated by the Klan. And this is just to give you an example of like how that transition happened, how you can have an individual like this, and then later they actually be killed. Really kind of gives you a sense of the violence and the pushback that started to occur as a result of all of these gains. Now I'm passing it off to Kim. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Andrew. So we're going to talk a little about the repression and the counter-revolution during Reconstruction. So the anti-Klan struggles that Sasha touched on were actually a really key part of the legal element of the first wave of radical Reconstruction. So throughout Reconstruction, especially in the 1870s, you get these acts passed. You get the Enforcement Act of 1870, which prohibited discrimination by state officials in voter registration, based on race, color, condition of servitude, or anything like that. They established penalties for interfering with the person's right to vote, and also authorized the president to use the army to uphold the act. You also get a second Enforcement Act, and you get the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which are pretty much just like the original. They just put in more severe punishments. The act also banned terror groups, terror force, or bribery to prevent people from voting because of their race. And there were other laws put in place to actually ban the KKK. And then so can we go to the next slide? Okay, so as the Civil War begins to come to an end, as the Civil War came to an end and the era of Reconstruction began to take shape, the planter class was refusing to give up their allegiance to white supremacy and racial capitalism. So passed in 1865 and 66, the Black Codes, whose sole purpose was to relegate Black people back to servitude-like conditions and guarantee a supply of cheap labor, but they varied from state to state. Mississippi was one of the first states to actually pass Black Codes, followed by South Carolina, and they actually borrowed very, very heavily from slave codes. One governor in South Carolina actually stated, Blacks must be, quote, restrained from theft, idleness, vagrancy, and crime, and taught the absolute necessity of strictly complying with their contracts of labor. And those codes, and I listed some of the things, they were mandated for labor contracts. They prohibited interstate migration. They limited political participation, and they made vagrancy punishable. So these codes would actually set the stage for the ongoing counter-revolution that would be waged against radical Reconstruction. Next slide. Thank you. So most of the planter class did not think that the Black Codes were harsh enough, and they actually took matters into their own hands by funding and actually promoting terror groups like the KKK in 1865. This photo is actually a Thomas Nast cartoon, and it's a White League and KKK kind of holding hands over Black people. So it was plenty of stuff, like basically that's what happened. So with the passing of the Reconstruction Act of 1867 and the Civil Rights Act a year before in 1866, the new era of radical Reconstruction began, and political and physical violence intensified. You had the White League in Louisiana, the Knights of the White Camellia, and later the Red Shirts of the Mississippi and the Carolinas. And these were all very, very violent, horrible groups that it was terror. It was terrorism. It was a counter-revolution. And the sole purpose of these organizations were to wage a counter-revolution against Black and white Republicans alike, to destroy the Reconstruction government and use violence to intimidate people from voting. Black people participating in politics and being their own economic agents was the driving force behind this terror. And in nearly every conflict, white conservatives initiated violence in reaction to Republican rallies or conventions or elections where Black men could vote. Next slide, please.
One of the most tragic aspects of Reconstruction is that the more African Americans achieved, the more they put their lives at risk.
I could hear the noise of the horses.
They Ku Klux my house.
They had on white gowns, masks on their faces.
75 men.
They were Ku Klux.
They tore her clothes off.
I was blindfolded. Cut me with knives.
They whipped me.
They whipped me.
Put a rope around my neck to hang me.
Southern Democrats used violence and terror tactics to disrupt Republican control and plot their return to power. They saw themselves as the redeemers of their states.
Violence is efficient, it's easy, it's fast, and you can often do it under the cover of night. Klan attacks become so pervasive because that's how widespread the fear of Black enfranchisement is.
The Klan is actually committing atrocities against everyone. They're attacking freedmen and white Southerners who were sympathetic to the Union cause and to the Republican Party.
To their eyes, emancipation was wrong. They are washing the South with blood to redeem it.
Sorry, I meant to give y'all a content warning. I apologize. Oh, thank you. So despite the race riots throughout the 1870s, Black people still continued to organize through political means and in their local communities. Repression and intimidation from the former planter class was vicious, but did not deter Black people. Groups of Blacks stood against these terror groups, participating in union leagues as early as 1867. Black longshoremen across the South went on strike, which not only secured the rights of 4 Black people in factories, but also served as a way to organize politically and educate community members. Black women also took part in different activities. There were rallies and parades to get the vote out and different things like that. And also when they had these mass meetings, women were actually able to make votes on certain things. And one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was in 1867, there was a Republican state convention and opened in Richmond, Virginia, and the Black tobacco workers actually went on strike. Everyone went on strike so that they could go to the convention, and things like that were happening all across the South. It was plenty of strikes, plenty of rebellion and resistance against all of this massive repression. Okay, next slide. Thank you. This tradition of standing up against the face of oppression and being dedicated to the cause of Black liberation laid the foundations for 2 revolutionaries of the late 1880s and early 1900s, Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois. Ida B. Wells was a journalist who investigated lynchings in the South and made them publicly known through the pamphlet that she published, Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws, in all its phases. It was not only reporting on lynchings that happened throughout the South, but also served as an analysis of the political conditions that allow these lynchings to continue. W.E.B. Du Bois published Black Reconstruction in 1935, which was a direct response to propaganda being put out about the failure of the radical Republicans during Reconstruction. Du Bois speaks to the revolutionary character of the Reconstruction era and analyzes the relationships between the planter class, the Black worker, and white worker, and emphasizes the gains made in Reconstruction that are still in place today. Okay. Next one. So this is actually a quote from Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and it's talking about the end of Reconstruction. So in 1876 came the bargain between big business and the South. The Republicans guaranteed that Mr. Hayes, when he became president, would allow the planter capitalists under the name of Democrats to control the South. Democrats promised to guarantee peace, good order, protection of the law to whites and Blacks, or in other words, exploitation should be so quiet, orderly, and legal as to assure regular profits to Southern owners and Northern investors. Next slide. So in 1877, President-elect Rutherford B. Hayes, having lost the popular vote in these 1876 elections, and with election outcome uncertain in the electoral college, agreed to what became known as the Compromise of 1876, or excuse me, as the Black community called it, the Great Betrayal of 1876. Hayes and Republicans agreed to move all remaining federal troops from the South in exchange for the Republicans retaining the White House. Just to give a little more context on the Republican Party, the Republican coalition that was built was anti-slavery, but not pro-equality. For the new industrial bourgeoisie, not much was needed beyond the end of slavery and preservation of the Union. And in fact, it was more lucrative to essentially just revive the plantation economy in a different guise than to try to build a whole new social world via Reconstruction. Ultimately, the betrayal was a result of the class breakdown in the Republican coalition. The bulk of the capitalists, petite bourgeoisie, wannabe petite bourgeois, and racist groups of workers worried about labor competition all of a sudden and saw their material interest in suppressing Black freedom and not expanded it. And the counter forces to these moves, mainly restricted to the Black community, were not really strong enough to resist. The betrayal of Reconstruction became a precondition for consolidating the new rising monopoly capitalism by ending slavery and then limiting disruption in the Southern economic setup beyond the federal troops. The federal troops were removed in one state to another, each resulting in the reversal of political and economic gains for African Americans. And just listed are just a few of kind of the agreements that Hayes made to be able to become president. So removing the military forces from Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, reserving a seat for a Southern Democrat in Hayes's cabinet, and basically he gave the South the right to govern Black people how they saw fit without the North interfering. That was one of the major things. They left the South to their own devices, and that was basically the end of Reconstruction. All right. Next slide, please. So with the end of Reconstruction, the ruling class took no time in writing statutes that put the planter class back in full control of their labor force. Vagrancy laws were put into place that made sentencing harsher than ever for Black people for the smallest crimes. Not tipping your hat to a white person could result in either a long prison sentence or murder or some type of violence being enacted on you. These new laws gave way to the convict leasing system, which laid the foundation for the modern prison industrial complex, with Black people still being shuffled into prisons and used for free labor. The end of Reconstruction gives way to the fascist Jim Crow era. The number of recorded lynchings was about 3,446 Blacks and over 1,200 whites between 1882 and 1968, with the peak occurring in the 1890s. With industrial capital and Wall Street control the economy, small farmers, tenant farmers, and farm workers, both white and Black, decided to work together and organize against their shared enemy. By the 1880s, an organized economic movement had begun to form. It was the populist movement, and that's what we're going to talk about now, Southern populism. The working class soon came to the sharp conclusion that the Republicans and Democrats only worked in the interests of bankers, landowners, and other members of the upper class. The Populists was formed by the Southern Farmers Alliance. At the same time, there was a growing populist movement among Black people in the South. This movement among African Americans began one of the largest movements of the time. There was already labor. So the Southern populist movement, the Southern populists was basically made up of different labor organizations. So there were already labor unions and organizations established in the mid 1880s. You know, you had the Colored Wheels in Arkansas, the Cooperative Workers of America in South Carolina, Knights of Labor in North Carolina, and the Colored Farmers Alliance in Texas. So building a multi-racial coalition paid off. The populists took control of the state legislatures in both 1894 and 1896 in North Carolina, and the governorship in 1896. Restrictive rules on voting were repealed, and Black allies were rewarded with seats in government, with 300 Black magistrates being named in Eastern counties. The populist movement was a very huge political movement, and it came with so many gains, especially coming off of the end of Reconstruction. So they established farming exchanges, raised money for schools, published newspapers, they lobbied for better legislation, they mounted boycotts against agricultural trusts, they carried out lots of different strikes across the South. They protested the convict leasing system and lynching, and they demand Black jurors in cases involving Black defendants. Despite the defeat of the Populist Party due to the racist propaganda and a violent white supremacist election campaign, the ruling class made sure that there would not be a second Reconstruction. So next slide, please. This is my last slide. And this was just like a newspaper clipping and an article that I found about the People's Party, where they would have like these Farmers Alliance picnics and everything like this, and then like a little newspaper ad that Black people put out to talk about the Colored Alliance and to try to get people to join it. And it was a huge, huge movement. And the populist movement was such a huge movement. It made so many gains, even coming out of Reconstruction. So I'm going to pass it back to Andrew.